Snow had a way of muting the world as thoroughly as a hand over a mouth. That morning in the Ares' high garden, Sansa felt it gather softly on her lashes while she stood with her gloved hands in the drift piled against the low wall. The air was so clean and thin it bit through wool and skin alike. Below her, mountains ran off into valleys as gray and secret as old memories. A bend of white river caught the new light and held it like a blade. She could hear, far down the courtyard, the sleepy clatter of a stable door and the muffled, impatient whicker of a horse. Closer by, the slow, patient footfalls of Ser Lothier Brune as he paced along the inner parapet. The guards moved like bundled shadows. The flags hung down like tired promises. She let her fingers shape the snow, made out of it the suggestion of a wall, then a tower. It should have exhilarated her, the child of winter finding winter even in a stone eyrie built for clouds. But the chill that settled along her neck was not only from the wind. The color of the sunrise was a thin wash, pale as watered wine, and it made the mountains look like a painting left too long by a hearth. She closed her eyes just a moment and tried to imagine. Soft roofs under a burden of snow, a godswood where red leaves held white the way a hand holds a letter, the deep smell of wolf and pine. In the mind's ungoverned place, she called that vanished home by name and felt the bones of her chest shiver at it. Elaine. She did not turn at once. The name waited, as always, like a mask set carefully upon a stand. One might lift it and put it on without disturbing the powder or the paint. When she faced him, she had the mask in place and lowered her eyes with a warmth she had taught them. My lord. Peter's boots left thin scars in the snow as he came closer, the fur at his collar a thin streak of night against all that washed-out dawn. The mockingbird pin rested just below his throat, a glint of silver that seemed to catch every pale ray and make a little summer of itself. His breath smoked as he smiled. Child, he said, as he often did to remind her he was done with being reminded. You'll freeze into a statue and give some bard the wrong idea. Come away from the wall. I like the cold, Sansa said. It's honest. The words came from some place in her that did not belong to Elaine at all, and for a heartbeat she watched surprise flicker across his face in the quick, near-invisible way a fish shows its belly. Honesty, Peter murmured, dangerous in any season. He stood beside her and looked out, his eyes taking stock of distances, of paths that were little more than scars on a white hide. He had a way of viewing the world as if he were negotiating with it. A slope might bargain for 10 lives or none. A village might be bought with a kind word and sold with a shrug. A snowfall could be both veil and blade, depending on who needed to see. Below, a bell gave its thin copper voice to the air. First breakfast called for the garrison and the servants. Sansa could feel the household stirring not as noise but as a kind of warmth that passed through stone. The eyrie woke slowly in winter, like an old lord whose bones had all taken offense. Everything required coaxing. Everything took a little longer than it would in a place less proud of its heights. Walk, Peter said, offering his gloved hand, and she thought of accepting it. He liked to be accepted. He liked to practice how it looked. In the end, she let her own hands rest at her sides and moved through the slow blue of the morning with him. Ser Lothier fell in behind them, his eyes steady on the corners of the world. Sansa did not look back. The garden lay within a ring of low walls, as if it too must be protected from the sky. Snow had drawn soft maps over everything. The rosemary shrubs were tents gone down in a silent war. The lemon tree in its clumsy box had been pulled into a quiet alcove and wrapped in wool as if it were a child needing comfort. Sansa had argued for it. The cold here would kill any southern thing that was not watched with human attention. She had learned something of that, too. They passed beneath an arch that held a thin fringe of ice, and that fringe chimed at their shoulders the way a charm might against a throat. Inside the covered walk, lamps burned with a dim economy. Peter paused there, as if lamps could guarantee the seriousness of his words. You slept? He asked. Yes, she had and not. She had drifted along the edges of some dream where snow bit her palms, and she could not tell if the wet on her hands was melted ice or her own blood. In the dream, she had been building something so patiently while voices called to her from windows, from doors, from the stairs above and the rooms below, and from the sky where crows wrote their black arithmetic. "You worry," he said lightly, "and when you worry, you arrange snow into the shapes of places you are too wise to name while anyone is listening." His smile did not change. "The Lord's declarant come today. Bronze Yon loves ceremony more than he loves prudence. He will be punctual. They will find us tidy and grateful and entirely predictable." "I am two of those things," Sansa said. He laughed softly. "Always my delight. We will speak to them in the great hall. I'll have Nestor tattling in a corner so they feel someone has told them what they want to have heard. I'll have the boy, our delicate Robin, look thin and lordly. I will wear a cloak that pretends I am colder than I am. And you, my dear, will be my citadel. If they batter you with questions, you must shrug. If they praise you, you must be gracious in a way that reminds them of their best wives and of the girls they could not afford. When they beg for mercy for this or that kinsman, you must look at the floor as if you can see exactly where mercy would carry them and be dutifully afraid of the drop." "And the truth, my lord?" Sansa asked. He made a small, thoughtful sound. "The truth is a blade that takes your fingers with its sheath if you are uncareful. We will keep it where our gloves are thickest." He called her child and dear and girl, and sometimes those words were a gentleness that lay down in her like a fatigued dog, and sometimes they were a low fence he preferred to keep around something. She played Elaine the way a skilled guest plays the harpsichord set out in a host's parlor. No louder than necessary, gracefully, without surprise. But the winter had moved through her like a spy and reported everything she could not stop it from seeing. They reached a small door, and beyond it the stair that led down toward the kitchens. Heat spilled up from there, smoke and broth and bread and onions, and the sour-sweet tang of cider warming for the high tables. Two kitchen girls stood speaking in quick, practiced whispers. They curtsied when the lord and his ward, his daughter, his asset, passed them, kept their eyes down, continued their conversation on the soft slant of scandal the moment backs were turned. Gossip moved like steam, invisible until it condensed and beaded on someone's fate. Peter guided her not to the kitchens but to a small, stark room that had only a narrow table and a brazier lit and purring. Upon the table lay a neat sheaf of parchment, a black-feathered quill, a bottle of ink whose rim was already kissed with frost. There was a low chair on one side, a taller chair on the other. The taller chair was for the one who thought to keep higher ground even while seated. He chose the lower chair, sighing as if he had given up some part of himself to comfort hers. "Sit," he said, and Sansa took the tall chair without smiling. He liked to see her elevated if it was his act that made it so. "We must consider," he said softly, "what the lords will ask for and what we intend to give them, which will be something else entirely. I will yield a little snow to keep the drift in place. Bronze Yon will want the boy to be healthier than he is by spring. It will let him keep a mirror of the past next to his bed. I will promise him experts from Gulltown who know the care of children. Nestor will want another inch of honor on his sleeve. I shall let him write his name larger on the parchment. Horton will want money and a prettier widow than he can get without me. I shall give him one and recover her in due course. The rest want to be told they have been brave." "And what do we want?" Sansa asked. He tipped his head toward her, courteous as a cat. "You know." She let the silence argue. "To be in a place the snow favors," he said. "To be in a place where letters arrive so often we need hire an extra boy to carry only ribbons. To keep a boy lord alive until he is old enough to give away his toys, which is all a lord ever does. To put food where there is none, fast enough that we are credited with the miracle and not the weather. To make enemies need us before they remember they hate us. And the throne." The saying of it was like putting her tongue to the back of a knife. Difficult not to press harder simply to feel the danger. He did not blink. His fingers were busy with the cork in the ink bottle, then with settling the quill, then with arranging the parchments closer to him and then pushing them toward her. "A throne is a piece of furniture, my dear, a chair and a story that makes sitting in it seem larger than a man. And you have a story." "I have several," Peter said lightly. "I will choose one depending on which men come to listen, and we will see if I must change songs midway. But this throne, you mean?" He cocked his head. "Ah, that is a story much better told by your face than by my lips. Because I am a girl," Sansa said. "Because," he murmured, and his voice lost its play entirely. "You are the North and the Vale and the Riverlands with their breath held. You are the daughter of a man who did not know how to lie and a woman who apprenticed a city to love her. You are the kindness in a hall no one trusts and the winter in a land that has mistaken summer for inheritance. Your name can be a bridge, and bridges are the only structures kings cannot afford to burn even when they require it." He smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Yes, because you are a girl, and the world is too weary to be seduced by swords alone." She thought of bridges, how they carried armies and markets and lovers and plagues, how the most beautiful ones were always targets, how when they fell the water swallowed noise faster than people could run. She thought of her name in a hand that had not held it in years. The cold was patient at her ankles. "The Lord's declarant," she said at last, "will ask about my parentage again. You will remind them you are my daughter because a piece of paper says so, and that paper is guarded by men who enjoy their work. Love is made credible by ink and a wax seal. They will shoulder that fact and try not to remark on its weight. They will call me Elaine. They may," he allowed, "be taught to anticipate the day they do not." She looked down at the parchment, at the place he had left her name. It was blank because it had to be. The letter it would anchor was a clever thing, full of flattery that had been carefully vaccinated with alarm. It would go to Gulltown's shipmen and offer them a winter's work hauling grain from the Ares storehouses to harbors where men had not planned for honest cold. It would whisper that the city that had once used wildfire to burn its hunger into the air was now listing like a ship in a basin. It would all but kiss the hands of captains and promise that the coin they earned would be of a weight they could feel in their grandchildren's pockets. "You will sign this, Elaine," Peter murmured. "And then, when it has passed from question to custom, you will sign as Sansa Stark to the men of the river and the trees. Later still, you will sign in a new way, and that way will require bells." "Bells," she said. She could hear the first ones, far below, calling the day to attend itself. He tilted his head as if listening to their echo. "The city has 100 bells and no good reasons for them. We will supply reasons." The room held them like hands might hold birds. Peter leaned back, watching her with an attention that could have made a woman tremble or a board rot. Sansa lifted the quill and wrote across the first page, careful of the ink and the curve and the place where a letter's throat must not be cut. When she had finished, she pressed the seal. A simple mockbird perched on a slash of branch, into warm wax, and held the paper up. The black line of her name looked like a river cutting a snowfield, and she knew well enough that every river eventually reached a sea. Peter rose in a rustle and a sigh. "The lords," he said, "let them have their day." They waited on the high dais while the great hall filled as a mouth fills when a hard truth is about to be said. Men stomped snow from their boots. Women shook the wet from their cloaks with the efficiency of those who have already done it 3 times that day. Bronze Yohn Royce came first among the declarants, his thick beard salted with white and his heavy cloak boasting its own genealogy. The weight of his gaze did not trouble Peter, who knew how to take weight and make it feel like a kindness. Horton Redfort's smile crinkled and uncrinkled like paper that had lost its moisture. He had an old man's appetite for feuds that could be placed on the table and carved with relish. Nestor Royce carried the Ares honor like a tray he impacted to keep level. The others came with murmur and steel, some looking up at the high windows because they could not help wondering if those windows were Judgment's eyes. They greeted the boy lord last. Robin sat beside Sansa, wrapped in furs as if his bones had become sensible of the wind. His face already had the delicate handsomeness that implies it will not grow more handsome with age. Sansa had fed him bread dipped in milk and water with a drip of honey at dawn, and he had kept it down. When he took Sansa's hand, it was with the clutching certainty of a child who hates any slope. She squeezed his fingers gently, and the boy's restless breathing steadied. Peter watched this with a look a passerby might mistake for paternal gratification. Sansa knew better. He tallied it. Bronze Yohn bowed with a rigid politeness. "Lord Protector," he said, making that title march with the heavy dignity He adjoined to everything he disliked. Lady Elaine. Peter poured warm cider deftly into cups and handed them to men whose wives would later ask very pointedly if riders did not fetch other beverages at home. Gentles, welcome. Our hall is your hall. And more to the point, our fires are your fires. Winter's honesty is best met with hospitality's answer. It did not take long for courtesy to lay down its arms and be coaxed away. Yon's brows drew together with honest impatience. We come about the matter of the boy's guardianship, he said, and his glance flicked to Sansa, who did not flinch, as if he could see what a mask looked like from behind. Peter nodded gravely. As so often we do, Lord Robin's health is improved. His tutors speak well of him. He wishes to continue the exercises we have set for his stomach and his chest. He has not been thrown through any more doors. A ripple of disapproval moved the hall like a breeze that thinks too well of itself. The last time the Lords Declarant had assembled, Peter had made a long, elaborate joke of the Ares dramatics to accomplish something else. The joke had taken Peter's own power out to the ledge and made it show the far drop. He'd returned with it only because he had leashed it to other men's appetites. Sansa could feel all of that in the air as one feels thunder in one's jaw. The stability of the veil, Horton said carefully, is the stability of us all. He was measuring the room, the boy, the girl, the man, the fire, the windows. We want a lord such that when we show him our swords, he gives us cause to gird them again. And you want that lord kept from sudden flights, and from stories that begin with his mother's name and end in the sort of ballad the faith scolds. Peter said, warmth and frost in the same cup. Yes, we want the same. The same. Yon's skepticism rested on the word like a hawk with its foot on a rabbit. Do we, Lord Baelish? The last time you spoke of sameness, we found ourselves awash in papers and promises and a gift of lands that once belonged to men whose cousins write me letters. Boys do not thrive on correspondence alone. Sansa felt Robin's hand clutch again. She shifted her fingers in a small pattern against his skin, the way one soothes a hive with smoke, and waited for Peter to smile. He smiled. Ah, Bronze Yon, if I gave you only what you asked for, the veil would be dressed very humbly indeed. I give you what you would ask for if you had woken earlier. The boy has begun to feel the ground. He can stand in the yard for the space of 20 counts while the physician speaks to him of the breath in his chest and how to coax it to be a good servant. He is eating with steadier appetite. He no longer throws food that arrives in bowls. These are not letters, my Lord Royce, but I can write you a list if ink convinces you better than witnesses. He gestured, and the master of arms, an honest, narrow man who did not understand humor, stepped forward and confirmed every word with the severity of his own boredom. Murmurs. Horton sipped cider. Nestor juggled the honor of the Aerie between the thumb and forefinger of his talk, keeping it upright. Peter turned his attention as if it were a penknife and applied it now here, now there, trimming, shaving, coaxing. Questions rose and fell. Sansa spoke when he indicated. A single sentence here, a second there. Her voice mild and serious, her eyes old enough to be believed, careful not to say any name that could be turned into a blade. She said, my father, only when she could mean Peter. She said, the boy, with a fondness that suggested she had never known younger brothers. She said, our stores and our ships and the weather and the gods, making those last two the only uncontested authorities in the room. In the end, the Lords Declarant did what all assemblies do when confronted with an argument that gives them the dignity of a concession already wrapped for their hands. They agreed to agree. The guardianship would continue. The boy would be sent, when the roads allowed it, down to a more temperate holding in the Vale for a season to drive winter out of his chest. The Master of Arms would increase his regimen. He would receive a hawk for his name day and be required to hold it on his wrist before witnesses without trembling beyond the allowance set by the best falconer present. And he would be seen by the knights in the yard while he walked, no more being lord only in rooms. Peter bowed his head. Our thanks, he said. Your prudence gives my ward the gift of years. Yon Royce's heavy gaze swung to Sansa again. And what of the girl? He asked. She is... He stopped because he would not say pretty, and he could not say useful, and he would not allow himself to say dangerous. The Lady Elaine, Peter said softly. Wishes to be a daughter who quiets her father's house rather than one who excites it. I will arrange a match for her with the care one uses in placing a candle near a curtain. Silence. Even the fire listened. Sansa held herself still, a page waiting to be written on. A match, Horton Redfort said. He smiled with the kind of interest men get when the topic takes on a shape they can carry. Will you sell her twice, Lord Baelish? Peter's smile did not change. Only once, but very dear. And soon, Nestor prompted carefully. Soon enough, Peter said, and when his eyes slid to Sansa, she let hers meet them and found there a question whose answer had never been hers alone to give. After the lords had been satisfied and flattered into luncheon and flanked by servants with trenchers and talk, Peter let the hall's noise run out like the cold along a corridor and then turned to Sansa. The boy was taken for his nap by a nurse who understood that comfort is a schedule and a tone of voice, and Sansa and Peter stood alone on the dais for a span. You asked me what we want, he said. I remember, she murmured. He studied her with the open indulgence a man uses with a clever child when he plans to give her a puzzle with a missing piece. Sansa, he said, not Elaine, and his use of the name struck the room like a small bell no one else had heard. It is time we marry. She had thought the moment would taste of iron and salt, that it would come in some place where the shadows lay down longer than they do in morning, where she would be forced to agree because there was a blade at one throat or another's. She had imagined, because fear imagines what it likes, that she would be a doll in some arrangement about to be set into a window. Instead, the words were offered to her with an almost businesslike ease, like a map placed on a table. See, child, the mountain and the road that circles it, and the path that appears dangerous but is merely steep. You mean, she said carefully, the mask under her face shifting its balance upon her cheekbones. For the sake of the boy, for the sake of the realm, he answered, and there was no smile anywhere near this. For the sake of what you are by nature and what I am by education. You will bring winter's legitimacy to the table. I will bring the table. We will be the bridge. You will be queen to the story. I will be king to the work. The throne, he added, and now his mouth found its edge again, is a thing made of blades. We will put a cushion on it for you. She thought of her mother's hair and her father's laugh and of King's Landing's heat that had once seemed to press her open like a heavy hand. She thought of the boy asleep now, how his breath had trembled a little and then steadied, a lesson he was teaching himself. She thought of a different boy at a wall of ice, and of a brother lost between the idea of a crown and a river's current. She thought, for only a breath, of a girl building a castle out of snow. For the sake of the realm, she said softly, and for the sake of myself. He inclined his head. I have never known you to be careless with that, my dear. In the Ravenry they chose the swiftest birds and tied their small letters with threads as slender as secrets. The words were sparse, careful as the steps of a girl on an icy stair. To Gulltown went the request for ships ready, to the river lords the newly plausible rumor in which the name they'd almost dared say too loudly at their own hearths was written in a hand they had once believed vanished from the world. To certain captains of the Goldcloaks went bland offers of winter pay in exchange for winter loyalty, and to a man whose hand was always clean of the ink he drank, a mockbird feather with nothing at all attached. He would understand that the message was, not yet, but be ready. There were letters Sansa wrote and did not send. One she folded and unfolded and then fed to a brazier along with a sprig of rosemary. The smoke that rose from that married thing made a scent like something remembered a little too late. She watched it go and told herself she had saved a different house from burning. They wed in a godswood the sky had turned into a beautiful threat. The Ares godswood was a pale remnant of older places, yet the heart tree's thin red leaves clung even in that height and season. Its face had a look like the wisdom of people who have seen more cruelty than they can bear and are continuing anyway. Snow fell in those slow, thoughtful flakes that make men turn their faces up and consider their own breaths. Sansa wore gray not because the North taught her to choose it for mourning and resolve, but because the gray made her hair a word she could not otherwise say. Peter wore black and a mantle of brown fox. The mockingbird brooch was bright at his throat, incongruous amid vows directed to other attention. The Septon Peter had coaxed from Gulltown spoke the points required. Peter pronounced his lines with gentle clarity, as if he were offering the whole gods would a cup and did not want to spill. Sansa said her words, steady as a woman reading a prayer she had copied herself. They were wed by old gods and new coin. After, as they walked back across the courtyard where the snow devoured the evidence of their steps, he touched his hand to her wrist as if to test whether his containment was complete. She did not draw away. A marriage was a pact. A pact had to be visible to be believed. The boy lord scattered petals from a small basket with solemn care until they all blew into his face. He sputtered and laughed in a high, ungoverned way that made 3 guards smile without permission. Sansa took the basket from him and tilted it down so he could see it was empty. "There," she said softly. "We used them all. Was it good?" Robin asked. "It was," Sansa said, "and let that be true enough for the moment." Gulltown answered quickly. Ships would be provisioned. Captains would be made to understand they were not to argue with weather but to negotiate with it. The Riverlord's letters came slower, as if they had to let the paper sit on a table for 3 days in a room where the young men of their houses pretended not to read it while passing. When they came at last, they were eager and careful, full of references to old alliances and the way a man's name can make a dinner taste better and safer when spoken over it. One letter had, in its margin, a smear that might have been ink or grease or tears. Sansa did not touch it, but she noted the way her heart moved at the thought that someone had held the paper with unsteady hands. Winter narrowed roads, but it also made them honest. Grain moved through it as quietly as guilt. Men in the city whose job it was to count wagons began to note, with that particular suspicion that thinks it has discovered something grand, that certain wagons had passed and certain others had not. In the Red Keep, the kitchens learned to hoard fat the way a miser hoards news. In Flea Bottom, the cat population thinned and returned and thinned again. Preachers in the squares found that their stories were better received when they had a hero who was not a lord. They learned quickly how to make any man in his own story if he put something in the basket. Peter kept his letters brisk and nearly affectionate. He wrote to the master of coin with a kindness that made the man check his family's portraits to see if they had missed anything. He wrote to the High Septon with humility that served like a headdress. He wore it when it suited him. He wrote to the captains of the Goldcloaks as if they were all cousins and all might share a game. He promised them that, under him, their reward would be the steady, dull coin of unremarkable years. It was Sansa who wrote to the houses of the river and the trees. She did not ask allegiance. She did not threaten. She spoke of bridges and grain and shepherds and wolves who kept flocks safer by frightening worse wolves. She spoke, once, of a man who had carried a girl across a stream because she could not wade it without being seen, and how she had remembered his hands not as a rescue but as a debt to be repaid in the keeping of his grandchildren's grandchildren. She did not promise the return of any particular head to any particular wall. She promised that if a man desired to return to his family with fingers and belly intact, it would be easier to do so if he signed the paper attached. Peter read those letters with a narrow smile and did not change a word. He had her talk with him, late, by a low fire that kept the braziers soft pur going and made the room smell like iron made content. He asked her what she had read in the faces of the lords. He asked her what she heard in the tone of the carpenter who came to quote for repairs to a gatehouse. He wanted to know if Sansa heard ambition or sorrow or the domestic determination of a man who wanted his daughter married to a better roof. He asked her what she, as a queen might one day, would do about the price of salt. "Nothing," she said, "at least not yet, because," his voice was lazy with approval and bait, "because to lower the price is to court goodwill we will not be able to count as ours. To raise it is to make enemies we cannot afford. To keep it the same is to be accused of from now on by men who require the sensation of event. So we do nothing," Sansa said softly, "but we send salt to a street where the women sing in a way people like to report they overheard." He laughed and touched the air near her sleeve. Since the wedding he had been careful with his hands around her in the presence of others. He was too wise to cheapen a pact by making it visible as only a private pleasure. Alone, he sometimes let his fingers rest on the edge of the table close to hers, the nearness itself a small exercise of power. She made herself not notice the warmth. The letters from King's Landing grew more nervous as winter went about its business. The crown behaved like a woman who believed she had been made plain overnight by some error committed while sleeping. All her letters were cosmetics applied with a trembling hand. The Queen Regent, for the boy who wore that other crown when he was not being told what he liked, sent demands that were careful to sound like requests until the end, where they put on their true shoes. She wanted grain. She wanted men. She wanted the veil to remember that a certain arrangement in a certain summer had bound it to a certain love. Peter's answers were a study in docility. Of course he wished to serve. Of course the veil would prefer that the city not behave as a large candle dropped into a brazier of oil. Of course the Eyrie had nothing but unbounded respect for the way the city kept the faith busy and the theaters full. He promised grain, the grain arriving even as he promised it. He promised ships, the ships leaving Gulltown while he sealed his letter. He promised men, the men who would come slowly, require someone else's coin, and bring with them a rumor that they had left the Vale simply because the girl who had become a wife there had told them there was something better to do with their swords. Rumors did more work than coin in winter. Coin simply convinced a rumor that it presently had meat. They left the Eyrie in a small procession that behaved itself like weather pretending to be people. Sansa rode a gray mare who understood ice. Robin was bundled in fur that made him look like a child raised by a lactating bear. His cheeks got bright with the cold. His eyes grew steadier. Peter rode at Sansa's side and let the world see a gentle regard that had no urgency in it. Urgency speaks of weakness. The Knights of the Vale made a narrow glitter that slid along the road like a river with discipline. Behind them, carts, more carts, a line of captured winter that would be melted into other people's kitchens. Men came out of their houses to watch, not only because the procession affirmed that their world still possessed an order, but because even those who disapproved of Peter Baelish's smile enjoyed the sight of it cutting the weather. All men are creatures of spectacle. Only some admit it. At a turning where the road narrowed and a ruin of old stones watched them with blind patience, Sansa looked back. The Eyrie receded into cloud, a pale idea swallowed by the larger, older idea of the mountain. It would remain, as all instruments do when the tune changes. She felt inside herself the sense of being carried not only by the mare beneath her, but by something that had velocity and time attached to it. It was not joy, it was not dread. It was a knowledge that the story had turned its page for her. They reached the lower stronghold Peter had chosen for the boys' winter, a place where wind wore a tired voice but did not cut it. There, Robin learned to walk a little faster, to hold his breath in for 3 counts and out for 5, to hold a hawk without trembling beyond the allowance. Sansa watched him sometimes from a doorway and thought of all the boys she had known, the ways men had spoken about them with possession or pride or worry. This boy's survival had been an appointment in her life. She would keep it as strictly as she kept any other vow. She tightened his scarf herself when he let her. In the afternoons, Peter called councils in rooms that smelled of wax and parchment and men trying to sound taller than they were. He entertained arguments as if they were performers hired at short notice. The small council that belonged to him here had a master of ships who had once been a smuggler and now had the precise astonishment of a cat told, "He is to become a guard dog." A master of grain who could read and reckoned himself a saint of prices. A keeper of ravens who loathed their smell but loved the way information cut distances into bite-sized pieces. Sansa listened, and when someone turned to her as if to ask what a woman thought about a matter of wheels and axle grease, she gave an answer that revealed she had considered not only wheels but the men who would break them and why. Peter did not often correct her. When he did it with a care meant more for the room than for her. The correction did not sting. It taught. At night, when talk was gone and the court had turned into the snores and whispers of any household, he came to her chamber and they spoke in the low voices of those who have made themselves present to their fate. He was not rough, he was not gentle. He was deliberate. He preferred to prove how in control he was by how little he needed to take. Once he told her a story of a gull at Gulltown who had stolen a fish straight from the mouth of a seal. "I respect the audacity," he said. "I respect the hunger," Sansa said. They went downriver by slow stages. The ships that bore the Vale's grain rode heavily and without bravado. They were not warships and made no attempt to pretend. They had, however, sailors who had not been hired for their willingness to die gallantly. They had been hired to keep rude weather out of a hold and to arrive. They did so. Villagers came down to the quays and gawped. A woman in a brown shawl blessed Sansa with hands that smelled of onions and said a prayer with so many parts one could pick a character to play. "Thank you," Sansa murmured. "Keep your children fed." "I'll keep them fed and keep them cut," the woman said. "Sons are like bread. They rise to any hand." Peter watched Sansa, and later he said, "You show yourself to them in a way that makes them believe they have invented you." "It makes them love their own cleverness," Sansa said. "And when it is time to choose between two kinds of hunger, they will choose you because you made them love themselves." He smiled. "There are priests who have never understood as much." At Maidenpool they were met by men who had once been confident in their knowledge of who owed whom fish and who was to be required to sweep whose gutter. They had faced war like a man faces a storm he cannot name and had learned to live with wet grief. Now they warmed to the sight of carts and the efficient severity of men who had been told to write down how much they gave to whom. Sansa watched the writing. Peter watched the writers. He made note of who placed a thumb hard on his own totals, and who pretended to count but only moved his lips, and who smiled up at Sansa with a kindness that asked for nothing in return. Those last were the ones he trusted not to be dangerous. The others he kept and fed. News came to them the way weather comes. Unasked for, reliable in its unpredictability. A Sellsword company had taken a keep near Duskendale and was charging men for the right to use their own roads. A minor lord in the Reach had attempted to tax the faith and had found himself spoken about from pulpits with a precision that made his cook refuse him salt. Across the sea there were rumors of a girl with fire in her pocket and of a boy who might or might not be the heir to a throne no one could keep. In the north, men were beginning to tell each other that they were no longer willing to wait for news and were making their own out of what they had. Sansa listened to it all. She held it in and let it become heavy at the point in her chest where, once, she had thought a different kind of story would live. When at last the city rose before them with its battered beauty, Sansa found that the sight of it did not move her to dread or nostalgia. She saw it as a thing to be done. The city's walls were the same tired grin, the river gates teeth worn and proud. The domes and spires spoke of a faith that dressed itself every morning even when it could not afford to eat. The Red Keep stood above, red as an old bruise. Smoke rose in threads that found each other and became whole cloth over the steep roofs. "The city," Peter said softly, as if presenting a guest at a feast. "She is a beast and a bride, and we will not try to make her into a dowry." Sansa nodded. "We will feed her," she said. "We will," he murmured, "and she will thank us with only as much loyalty as can be eaten for supper the next night. But she will hold out her hand to us when we come. And her hand is all we need for now." They entered with no parade but with carefully managed notice. Carts and ships went to the places Peter had arranged for them to go. The city found itself smelling something like comfort and discovered that it wanted to like the man who had brought the smell with him. Peter did not go straight to the keep. To do so is to behave like a dog who does not know that his tail does not add to his height. He went to a tenement where fires had gone out in the rooms of men who prided themselves on being able to keep them. He placed coin with a woman who had not asked for it and then asked her for her name and repeated it back to her as if it were a song. Sansa watched a dozen such small scenes and understood. The city would do most of the work of loving them on its own if given a nudge and a meal. When at last they crossed into the Red Keep, the guard took them in with a suspicious civility. The steward who greeted them was a man whose posture was a sermon on how not to be surprised even by the end of the world. He escorted them through the familiar, and what had once been familiar seemed not to have the power anymore to make Sansa's stomach remind her of fear with a sour crouch. The great hall yawned like a hungry mouth. The throne sat at its end, a sullen, complicated idea made into furniture. Men had put work into it and then cut themselves on what they had made. The Queen Regent received them in a chamber that had been arranged to make bare cedar smell like moral rectitude. She was older by years than she wished, and by days more than she would admit. She wore her beauty like a bargain she had not liked making but now repeated every morning. She had men about her who wished to tell the room that it was theirs. They had learned only to purse their mouths. The boy king sat with a straight back and eyes that flickered from thing to thing like birds seeking not seeds but places to land and look important. "Lord Protector," the Queen Regent said. "Lady Elaine." "My queen," Peter said, and it was a title he gave her not because he believed it but because he wished the room to hear him. Sansa curtsied. She let her face be a place that could hold every emotion and none. The way a stage holds 1,000 plays and remains the same boards beneath them all. "We have begun," Peter said mildly, "to relieve the city with grain from the Vale." Proceeds. "I have instructed my captains to treat your officers with every care in the division. If they fail, you will tell me, and I will exchange those captains for ones who are literate." The Queen Regent's smile did not precisely exist. It was a notion, like summer. "I am gratified," she said, and the sound of gratification in her mouth was like glass being polished by cloth. "We are grateful for the Vale's loyalty." "Loyalty," Peter said, "is a habit best reinforced by lunch. I have also begun to pay certain men whose loyalty can be improved by the certainty of coin that will be present next week too. The gold cloaks will not be asked to choose between their hearts and their bellies." The Queen's eyes slid to Sansa like a blade being tested on a table. "And your daughter?" she asked, selecting the word with surgical care. "Has she found the city changed at all in her absence?" Sansa met her gaze evenly. "Cities are like men," she said softly. "They wish to be thought handsomer than they are and prefer to be told that their weaknesses are admired as quirks." One of the Queen's men smirked, then killed the expression because the room told him to. The boy king favored Sansa with a nervous, compelled smile of which he clearly had a restricted supply. He might yet have become a good man if he had been born to other kitchens. Sansa had no energy to waste on that thought anymore. She smiled kindly back and did not, later, mention him to Peter at all. They played their first weeks as if they were playing for small coin. In the morning, Sansa went among the street markets with 2 guards, a maid, and a woman from the kitchens who knew the price of an egg on any day of the week. She let people speak to her as if she could be asked for recipes and prevented from being asked for anything else. She learned the different tones in which a fishmonger praises his own catch and the different ways a thief looks at a mother's purse string. She heard the faith's new songs and determined which ones would last beyond winter. She saw the faces of orphan boys and girls and told the woman from the kitchens to find places for them among people who were already their cousins in everything but name. She bought a lemon and made herself bite into it there in the street and keep her face under control, and the women who watched this laughed until they forgot to be suspicious. In the afternoons, she sat with Peter as messengers came and went, and she lent her face to messages that needed that. Sometimes she sent the messenger away and told Peter he must let her write the answer. He let her, though he watched her hand intensely as if he could learn something about her soul from how ink worked when it was with her. He began to consult her not only on matters of grace and audience but on the spine of things. She told him with perfect seriousness that a corps of sewer workers must be paid well, and he did not laugh. He remembered what it is like to be made of the things men do not wish to mention in a hall. In the evenings they walked on a terrace where the wind from the sea was a voice that carried gossip from ships. They spoke of a girl with dragons across the water. They spoke of a boy whose name had begun to be said in Winterfell's rebuilt kitchens with the affection people reserve for someone they have never met. They spoke of the Reach's gardens and of Dorne's patience. They spoke of how long the faith's temper could be contained by money and pageantry, and whether it was better to give it a riot or a triumph to spend itself upon. They did not often speak of the throne. It sat in the hall like a sullen service always waiting to be used for boiling water or killing flies. They did not speak of love after the 3rd night. On that night, Peter had told her the truth he liked to tell, about a girl long dead and a boy he had not been yet. She had listened as if hearing the story for the first time, and when it was finished, she had said, "There is a room in me that story cannot enter. I will lock that door at night." He had bowed and had not attempted it again. His restraint was not respect, but it looked like it, and that suited them both. The first time someone called her, "Your Grace," it was an accident, or that is what all agreed to say. Sansa had gone with 2 maids and a guard into a chapel where the faith distributed bread and sermons in equal amounts. The Septon, small and stuffed with sincerity the way a cushion is stuffed with wool, had recognized her and gone pink in a way that made her like him. He'd taken her hand with clean fingers and had said, in the fullness of his gratitude, "Your Grace," because his heart had moved ahead of the polity. The word had hung in the small bright air like a ribbon caught on a hook. Sansa had not corrected him. The next day, men who had never been inside a sept used it in their kitchens to make their wives laugh. News of a single word travels not like a raven but like a rumor that has found its legs. Peter did not mention it until evening. They were on the terrace, the wind moving Sansa's hair forward in such a way that Peter reached out and smoothed it very gently back. "You did not rebuke the Septon," he observed. "I was in his house," Sansa said simply. "A guest does not shame a host, not even with truth. And now we have the truth waiting for us when we come home," he murmured, satisfied. "Words build rooms faster than masons." "Rooms in which to be cornered," Sansa said. "Rooms in which to receive," he replied. "We will put chairs in them. Let the Queen Regent come sit or refuse to sit. Let the city observe which looks worse." The confrontation came in the great hall where the throne sulked. The Queen Regent had decided to make a declaration of something, and declarations require backdrops. She arrived with her own retinue, the men whose duty it was to look like swords in human clothes, while Peter stood below the dais, and Sansa stood not with him but near the place where petitioners stand, so that she could be everybody's idea of humility. "Lord Protector," the Queen said, "Lady Elaine, the Crown is concerned." She paused, as if allowing the word to ripple along the benches and break itself upon the stones. People speak in the street with a familiarity that is unbecoming. There are titles being tossed about like apples at a harvest feast. We think this must stop. Peter bowed his head. "Your Majesty," he murmured, because he was too kind to deny her the balm of great words when she needed them. "We have been careful, as always, to honor the crown with the exact measure of attention it desires." The Queen's eyes flashed. "My son's rights are not a matter of measured attention," she said. "They are the axis around which this city spins." Sansa watched the boy in question. His face had the look of a child tired of having his body stood up and sat down for him by invisible hands. "Your son," Peter murmured, "will be well served by a city that has sausages enough to joke about. Titles in the street are better than curses on the walls. And as for Lady Elaine, her person is beyond reproach. She is my wife now." He let that last sentence travel into the hall like a knock made softly on a door at night. Men looked up, looked at him, looked at Sansa, and in their looking the new shape began to take on weight. "We will arrange," he continued graciously, "a ceremony that satisfies the faith's appetite for dignity. They lavish their dignity upon those who can make the baskets in their doorways look like they are always half empty. We will give them cause to ring bells and be convinced that they are the ones who set the meaning of each peal. Your son may attend and be applauded in all the proper places. We will speak of the realm. We will speak of winter and how it asks for a different kind of love than summer. We will speak of bridges," he went on, his voice quiet, "and who has been won. Then you may decide if the city is to be allowed to put its language where its hunger already rests." The Queen glared at Sansa as if the girl had arranged the weather. Sansa kept her eyes low and her mouth composed and let other people draw what relief they could from the sight of a woman behaving. Peter arranged that ceremony as a man arranges a table with courses calculated to create a single satisfied sigh by the end. He met with the High Septon and let the old man tell him that God desired order the way the body desires breath. He met with the Goldcloaks captains and let them talk to him about their boots. He made a note of which captain kept his boots in better health than his men. He met with the guildmasters and let them say the sentences men have said since guilds were invented, that their work is the very fabric of the city and that they must be seen as its warp and not merely as its tint. The day came with a sky like pewter and air that made breath visible as a series of small confessions. The The sept was full of people who had argued and triumphed and bargained their way to a seat. There were women who had never been inside a sept more than once a year who now sat straight as pins, their hands folded in the particular way that suggests both comfort and a readiness to flee. The High Septon wore himself like a castle. Men imagined he had always been that shape. He took Sansa's hand and spoke words whose meaning was less important than their tone. Peter stood beside her like a shadow that had learned manners. The Queen Regent attended, because absence is too loud when men are listening for an insult. The boy king sat and remembered to look impressed. Bells pealed as if they had been made for this one day alone. When the High Septon declared, with the solemn laziness of a man who knows his voice now carries what he says to every table, that the city had been given a queen for winter and that God would not take offense at anyone who found there, in that word, a reason to be more patient with their bread, the sound rose up like a new rumor born and thriving. Sansa's face did not change. Peter smiled like a man who has been given a seat at a game. He knew how to win even when everyone else was cheating. After, there was feasting because cities do not know what to do with solemnity unless it can be eaten. Peter walked among the tables with easy seriousness, letting men say things to him in corners and then saying back to them the very thing that made them believe it had been theirs all along. Sansa ate little and let women pull her aside to ask her what she thought about a dozen domestic wars. She answered without scolding or condescension. She took a child in her arms when that child's mother's eyes had glazed with too much wine. She kissed the child's hair and returned it with a smile. The room noticed and decided to tell itself a story in which it had already loved her for years. Late, when the candles had guttered low and the floor smelled of triumph and spilled ale, Peter took Sansa's hand and led her away from the hall and up into a room not their own, high enough that the city's noise became one long, honest sound. He closed the door and stood with his back against it, looking at her as if she were a problem he had set and now meant to solve. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was visible," she answered. "It is different. It is precisely the same," he murmured. "Visibility is the only majesty that matters in a city. We have it now. We will put it to work. We will feed them," Sansa said again. "And I will adjust the valves," Peter said. The engineer in him could not resist the metaphor. "We will make the Goldcloaks captains kneel without being seen to kneel. We will make the guildmasters bring their ledgers like schoolboys. We will sit you on a chair that looks like it could bleed and teach it to behave." He came closer and set his hand lightly upon her cheek as if testing whether the paint would smudge. She did not draw away. "Do you remember," he said softly, "how I told you the truth about the girl once?" "I remember," Sansa said. "Another truth, then," he murmured, his eyes happy with strategy. "I wish not to be king because I want a throne. I wish to be king because I want to be the one who makes kings look possible. A realm can live with a bad king for a time. It cannot live with the knowledge that kingship itself is broken. I will give them the illusion that it is not. You will give them the feeling that it is real. There are things you cannot control," Sansa said. "Of course," he agreed. "How else would I enjoy myself?" On the third night after the proclamation, a riot did not quite become a riot in the street below the Gate of the Gods. Two guilds whose names might as well be tempers and thumbs had chosen to disagree in a public place about whether one needed the other. Men shouted. A boy threw a stone because boys do and because stones need the excuse. Someone shoved someone whose sister had died the winter before, and grief is flint in a crowd. The not-quite riot grew legs. It had just begun to stand when Goldcloaks arrived in numbers and were very careful, because Peter had told their captains he would count, to break it into pieces without breaking any faces that would be missed. 1 man died of a mistaken heart. 7 were bruised into obedience. A woman lost her basket of bread, and Sansa arranged for a replacement and a small purse with a note insisting she purchase new shoes. The woman told the tale in such a way that even the men who loved her least were compelled to eat it. Across the river gate, a group of boys found a way to get their hands on the grain sacks. Peter elected not to notice for exactly 2 days. On the 3rd day, he noticed with a loudness that made the boys' fathers tell them, in low voices, that they had been treated mercifully by a man who could have hung them and who had only sent them to sweep for a week and to thank a lady. Sansa made certain the boys were fed at noon. The city retold the story in 100 versions. In most, Sansa was the person standing between the city's children and a rope. In time, independent of this or that event, it became normal to say her grace when speaking of a lady with red hair and a face that had learned how to put on gravity like a cloak. It became normal to say the king when one meant Peter, even though no coronation had been performed, and even though, in some more pious houses, men corrected their children for the usage while using it themselves after 2 cups. Peter delayed the crown because he wished to change the shape of the need. Desire for ceremony is a hunger as true as any other. He made the city crave it until it could not stop itself from demanding that someone hand it a cup to drink from. He promised the High Septon he would be allowed to speak in a new register. He promised the Queen Regent places to stand where her son's presence would mean something. He promised the faith a pageant of humility. He promised the gold cloaks extra boots. He promised the guildmasters that their banners would pass near the dais. He promised Sansa nothing except that she would be herself when the moment came, and that this would be worth more than any number of trumpets. The northern letters came slower, and they came with a skepticism that was not inaccurate. Men there wrote as if they believed handwriting could be a weapon. Some declared that a queen in King's Landing was not of the north and could not understand the way a direwolf thinks while it sleeps. Some asked after names of people Sansa did not dare write back about. Some sent only the winter's greetings that mean we are still alive. To one letter from White Harbor, Sansa responded with a page in which she described in exact detail the smell of a snow-heavy field at dusk in a place where fish are hung from rafters and the way light lies on ice. She signed her name and wrote Sansa very clearly and did not include any other word that would make a man hang. When the answer came, it had no words at all, only a small, careful painting done by a girl with steady hands of a white harbor under a sky the exact color of regret. Sansa put the painting on her table, beside the letters she did not send. A courtesan sent Sansa a cake with sugared violets and a note that read, in the neat script of someone educated by a patient man, for a queen who knows when sweetness is armor. Sansa sent back a length of fine linen and asked if the courtesan would be so kind as to speak to the girls in the kitchens about how to walk without being followed by trouble. The courtesan came and spoke, in terms that made the girls giggle and then grow quite sober, and left with a promise from Sansa that the next time one of the girls had a father who forgot the distance between his grief and his fists, a guard would be sent to have a word and see the man to his bed with a bruise he would understand. In all this, Peter moved like a man walking through a crowd that parted before him at exactly the right moment. He kept in his head a ledger so precise it could have been carved into bone. He knew how many guildmasters had switchable loyalties and how many believed in their own stories. He knew which members of the Kingsguard had debts that gnawed on them. He knew the name of a boy who had been used by a lord in a way neither could afford to have discussed, and he kept that name folded in a pocket and did not take it out until the day he needed the lord to stand up in court and declare loudly that a certain marriage had been performed with a certain legality no one would contest. He told Sansa some of this and not all. He did not lie to her. He merely allowed the world to continue its business without always being announced. When the coronation came at last, it came because the city needed something to point to with both hands and say we did this. The High September was scrubbed with a devotion that made even cynics stop making jokes at the sight of old women on their knees. Banners were mended and stitched with thread that had been bought with money men had once promised to use for other things. The Queen Regent stood where Peter had promised she would stand. The boy king looked handsome enough to be painted. Peter knelt. The crown placed upon his brow was not the one that had once sat upon heads in a way that made the city think a story had repeated itself exactly. It was a crown made for winter, iron and simple, with a single small stone at its front that made the surrounding metal seem to have agreed to the arrangement only after negotiation. The noise when the High Septon declared a king startled even the birds in the rafters. Sansa felt a quiver run through the room the way a living thing shivers when touched in the right, shocking place. Peter rose and turned and lifted a hand, and the gesture was exactly right, neither miserly nor wasteful. He did not look at Sansa then. He had already looked at her with the only look that mattered when they had stood in the small room waiting to be called. Then his eyes had said, "Not I love you," which would have been insult and error and weakness, but we are entirely ourselves today." She had nodded once, and that had been enough. After, he placed upon Sansa's head a circlet of silver with a sliver of pale stone that might have been ice if ice were a gem. The High Septon said some more words. Words are the currency of such moments and must be spent lavishly to convince people they have raised a monument and not emptied a purse. Sansa took the wag of the circlet with composure and found it lighter than she expected. She had been practicing for years for the weight of things unseen. In the days following, being king was a series of very specific, unromantic tasks performed with an attention that could make men despair or adore. Peter had been made for it. He sat in council and made 5 decisions about docks before breakfast. He appointed a new master of whisperers who did not enjoy being called that. He had been a scribe and knew the power of clean ink. He used it like a knife. He had the city cisterns inspected and then spoke 2 words to a man whose father had died of fever and ensured those cisterns would be cleaned by spring. He asked Sansa to design a relief for a wall whose bare patch had amused no one before but now looked like an accusation. She chose a bridge, carved with such patience by men who had never seen the north that, when it was finished, people standing beneath it said that for a moment they smelled pine. The Queen Regent learned a new way to walk in the keep. It involved sidestepping without being seen to do so. She kept her son's dignity like a candle in a draught and tried not to let anyone see how often it guttered. Peter gave her the respects required and no more. Sansa was courteous to her and did not refuse to sit when asked to sit. She kept the boy's attention as one keeps a cat's, briefly, generously, and then without drama let it go. There were trials. Men love trials because they let them believe that rules are visible and that the world is a game of stones and lines rather than of air. Sansa sat with Peter on the dais and watched as a miller accused a brewer of stealing water, and as the brewer retaliated with a complex and frankly admirable explanation of hydrology and moral probity. Peter listened and then settled the matter with the placement of a small, precise fine and the appointment of a 3rd man to watch the water everyone pretended belonged to someone. He did not smile. He found the smile cheapened justice too easily. There were executions. Peter made sure they were rare and that they made sense to people who see only 2 kinds of light, the one their hearth makes and the one the sun makes. When a gold cloak was found to have sold his sword twice in the same afternoon, Peter had him flogged and sent back to service instead of hanged. To do otherwise would be to make enemies with the men who make the city's sleep possible. When a lord's 3rd son raped a girl who sold fish, Peter had him taken to a square where the fish had been, and he had the man's head struck cleanly from his shoulders. He then sent the girl's family enough coin to feed them quietly for a year and warned them that if they told the story loudly, he would reduce the coin and double the listening. It was mercy of a sort. It was order, certainly. It turned the city toward him as plants turn toward whatever light keeps them alive. And all the while winter thickened. Snow fell as if it had formed a habit and loved its habit. The city's sounds grew lower and more honest. Sansa kept kitchens and wagons and wool moving. She held children and let herself be merry when merriment was a medicine. She walked in the godswood and permitted herself to run a finger along the bark of a tree that had seen more summers than there were men in the keep. She wrote letters and did not write others. She dreamed sometimes of wolves without fear and woke with her own heart racing in time to their running. She stood with Peter at a window and watched the city breathe and did not say aloud the list of disasters she knew could still happen. One evening near the end of their first winter in the keep, a raven came with a ribbon white as old milk tied to its leg. The message it carried was short and written in a hand that belonged to no one Sansa remembered ever seeing. It said only Winterfell stands, and beneath that, a crude drawing of a direwolf whose proportions were wrong in a way that hurt and comforted at once. Peter read it and made a face like a man tasting something he cannot readily identify. "Good," Sansa said, her voice a thing steadier than she had believed possible. "Let it stand. It complicates certain maps," Peter murmured, "and simplifies others." "It is not a map," Sansa said softly. "It is home." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his gaze she saw all the calculations of a man who believes his mastery consists in anticipating not only his enemies but the weather. Then he smiled, a rare, honest thing that he did sometimes when he found in her something he had not built. "Yes," he said, "it is. Later, when the city slept in that uneasy way cities sleep, one eye open, one hand on a purse, Sansa stood at a window and watched snow perform its unathletic miracle. A lantern swung in a courtyard. Somewhere, a woman sang very softly in a language Sansa did not know, and a child's voice answered a single word with weary devotion. The world was too large for any one person's hands and too small for any one person's grief. She felt the circlet's impression on her forehead like a remembered kiss. On the table behind her, the letters to be sent lay in their neat pile, some commanding, some consoling, some perfectly unremarkable. On another table, the painting from White Harbor sat like a window to a second window. Peter came in without a sound. He put his hand lightly on the back of a chair and considered the same snow. "We have made something," he said, as if that observation demanded proof and apology in equal parts. "We have," Sansa said. He turned to her then, his face a fraction softer than the stone the city had used for steps. "You know I will not stop," he murmured. "There is more to do. There are dragons to disprove. There are truths to make more comfortable. There are men to teach how to prefer the absence of chaos." "I know," she said, "and I know that there are things you cannot decide." He raised a brow. It was the closest he came, when not in public, to a shrug. "Name one." Sansa looked at him and did not smile. "When spring comes." He laughed softly, not in mockery but in that unguarded way that admitted another power than his own. The sound of it stitched itself into the room's quiet, and Sansa knew that if the city had ears for it, it would not forget. She crossed to the table and picked up a quill. The ink behaved obediently. She wrote a letter to a house that held an old grudge like a warm stone and told them to send a representative to the city to speak with her about roads and wolves. She wrote to a woman in the Riverlands who had lost 3 sons to 3 different ideas and asked her to come and work in the kitchens where a girl's hands could save a small world. She wrote to a lord in the Vale who had always wanted a better story and offered him a place in the street's safety that would be called something fine when men talked about it in taverns. Behind her, Peter took off his crown and set it on the table like a man placing a tool down after an honest day. "Her Grace," he said gently. "Your Grace," she replied, because it would always be true and untrue and necessary to say so. They went on then. The city went on. Winter continued its grammar lessons, and men learned once more how to conjugate survival. I keep, you keep, he keeps. They built a hall, they closed a street, they opened another. They changed a law with a word and then changed its meaning with a different word. They let a troupe of actors play them, and Sansa laughed and Peter frowned and then later laughed in private at how poorly his smile had been imitated. They buried a child who had no one, and the city was kind for 3 hours. They met a foreign ambassador who smelled of spice and skepticism and promised nothing and left the promise on the air like expensive smoke. They argued about sales and poets and whether lemon cakes could be made with less sugar without insulting God. They listened to rumors and made some and ended others. They became the work and the story of a place that had always been better at telling itself than at admitting who gave it the lines. One morning, snow fell with a faint hiss, as if writing its own name. Sansa woke with the knowledge that she had dreamed of wolves again. Not hunting, not howling, not dying, but running beside her in a wide white field where no one had put up any banners yet. In the dream, she had not worn a crown. In the dream, she had worn a scarf her mother had mended 3 times. When she told Peter, he said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "Bridges are not houses." And she thought of the truth of that and of how both can be shelters. She wrote the words down and did not send them to anyone. She had learned that some letters are only for the room where they are written. A raven beat its wings above the city and dropped a letter upon a stoop. A boy chased it and was chased in turn by a dog who had mistaken the letter for a game. In the keep, a maid rubbed a spot from a banister with a concentration that would have saved a marriage if anyone had let it. A man mended a shoe. A woman mended an oath. The sea lay beyond, cold and not particularly impressed by any of this. In the north, snow lay deep, and a man whose name had begun as a rumor put his hand upon a stone wall and felt there the memory that had made his hand. In the east, a girl climbed into a saddle that had not been made for her. In the Riverlands, an old man told a story to a child and left out the parts that would have frightened him enough to ask questions it would have hurt to answer. The world moved, not in obedience to any one hand, and yet responsive to the hands that moved with the humility of understanding this. In King's Landing, the king and his queen worked. They held the city together with food and spectacle, with justice heavy enough to make men hesitate and light enough not to break a mule's back. They made people say "our" when they meant "this city," and that pronoun did more than any law. They promised the future to people who needed it to show them their present more kindly. They did not break the throne. They upholstered it. They did not end hunger. They rationed it. They did not deliver the realm. They delivered today and then another today and informed men that this is all any king has ever been able to provide. And winter waited, within all that, like a story still writing itself. One evening, very late, Sansa returned to the terrace where the wind told the same news it always told and some it had newly learned. She stood at the parapet with the city and the dark beyond it for company. The air was cold enough to make her remember to become smaller to keep warm. She felt for a moment that she was not a queen nor a wife nor a girl who had been called by too many names, but a person who had been given a set of tools and told to go on making a shape. She thought of her father's hand on her hair. She thought of her mother's scent. She thought of snow in the godswood of a home that now stood again. She did not weep. She did not smile. She merely stood. Peter came after a time and joined her, and in the silence between them there was a peace like the quiet of a page ready for ink. He put his hands on the parapet also and looked down into the night. "We have arranged ourselves," he said at last, and Sansa could not tell if there was pride or fatigue in it. "For a while," she agreed. "For a while," he echoed, and if there was sadness in it, it was the sadness of a man who knows that even victory is a season. A bell rang, one of the smaller ones, like a thought remembered. They turned and went in to do what the hour asked of them. In the morning, they would hear a new rumor. That dragons had been seen beneath a sky that belonged to a different ocean. That a boy had been named king in a hall made very hastily and with great enthusiasm. That a lord in the Reach had declared his roses eternal. That the Iron Islands had found a song they liked singing again. In the morning, Peter would smile a very small smile and sharpen his quill. In the morning, Sansa would call for bread and broth and a dish of lemons, and she would go down into the kitchens and taste the broth herself and say yes or no. In the morning, snow would still be falling, perhaps, and men would still be eating, and a city would wake up and require being held together for another day. Night held them a little longer. The wind, having delivered its news, let the window rest. The city breathed, a creature with too many lungs and yet only one. The crown on the table made no sound. The letters waited. The world continued. And from far away, a place the snow had not yet reached, rumor raised its head and began its long, careful walk toward them.